Good evening all, and welcome. Before the video begins, I'd just like to give a huge thank you to all my amazing patrons. Thank you all for helping keep the channel running. If you'd like to learn more about becoming a patron as well as getting some pretty cool perks, you could find the information in the description. And it helps keep Mortis Media floating. So thank you everyone. And today's Patreon star is Araceli Haman. Thank you kindly. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable for tonight's extra long bonanza of Skinwalker stories. So let the darkness take control. This story didn't happen to me, but I heard it many times when I was growing up. My grandparents owned 80 acres about 20 miles east of Snowflake, Arizona. They had moved to the land in the early 80s, after my grandfather had retired from the mine in San Miguel, Arizona. The land was pretty barren. I don't know why they chose to buy it. Red sandstone bluffs and dry wash cuts across the landscape, dotted with juniper and cedar trees, and red sand everywhere. I suppose at the time, the land was cheap. They didn't have close neighbours. The closest was about a mile away, which was my aunt and uncle. The next closest neighbour was a man named Stoddard. I never got his first name, just Stoddard. He lived about 4 miles away from my grandparents, at the base of one of the sandstone bluffs. He was an arsehole rancher, from what my grandparents said. He thought that he owned everything and was entitled to do whatever he wanted. More than once, my grandpa had caught Stoddard cutting my grandfather's barbed wire fence to let his cattle onto my grandpa's land to graze. Now, this area is full of ancient Anasazi Pueblo ruins. Most of them have been destroyed by ranchers with backhoes trying to find pots to sell. I'm sure Stoddard was one of them. So the story goes one day, after losing a calf, Stoddard stumbles upon a cave sealed by a giant slab of sandstone against one of the sides of the bluff. Curious about it, he used a backhoe to remove the boulder. After going inside, he discovers it's an Anasazi burial cave. I'm sure he was delighted. He starts taking things from the burial cave and selling them. Well, from that moment on, he had some pretty shitty luck. First, he lost about $500,000 on the stock market. Then his cattle all got diseased and died. In financial ruin, he gets another blow, and his wife is diagnosed with an extremely rare disease and dies. Then Stoddard gets thrown from his horse and loses the ability to walk. This all happens within a couple of years. He tells everyone he knows that he's cursed from the Anasazi burial. They laugh it off. Stoddard puts all the artifacts back, and he seals the cave with the boulder. He abandons all his belongings and leaves one night. This is late in the 1980s. Fast forward a couple of years since Stoddard abandoned his ranch house. The land and house are bought by a man from California. He puts the ranch house up for rent. My aunt is pregnant with her first son and decides to move from San Miguel to Snowflake to be closer to her parents. Stoddard's house is fully furnished, and so my aunt and her husband move on in. He finds a job working nights at the local paper mill. It is very creepy out there at night. At first it seems like a nice little place. Creepy at night, but not too bad. Then weird stuff starts happening. My aunt starts hearing faint chanting and drums at night. She brushed it off. She had a hippie neighbor that lived about a mile away on the bluff, so she figures it must be them doing hippie stuff. But she can't help but feel like someone, or something, is always watching her all the time. She starts having nightmares every night, but chalks it up to being alone and hormones. She finally tells my grandpa about it, and he loans her his dog to keep her company at night. She drives the dog out there, and he refuses to get out of the truck. The hair on his back straight up and growling. She gets freaked out, but figures maybe he saw a rabbit or something and hauls him into the house. The dog just stares at the door and growls. That night, he growls and barks all night. The drums and chanting are louder. The next morning, my aunt finds human bare feet footprints around the house. So this goes on for about a week. The dog barks and growls at night. Nightmares when she finally does sleep, and footprints in the morning. Then chanting and drums keep getting louder. She finally feels like she's losing her mind. So she asks my grandma to come over and stay the night with her. Grandma is more than happy. After finishing her chores, she heads over planning to make my aunt a nice meal. This is late in the afternoon. My aunt lays down for a nap, comfortable now that my grandmother is there. My grandmother decides to take a little walk at the base of the bluff. My grandma was a very religious person. She was very active in the church and devoted her life to Jesus. As she's out on her little walk, she likes to look for pottery shards or arrowheads. A little way from the house, she gets a very unnerving feeling that something is watching her. She said it made her skin crawl. She could sense something evil. So my grandma prays and walks back to the house, pleading the blood of Christ. She decides not to say anything to my aunt, who is awake because she is already frightened. She tells my aunt maybe it's better if they go stay at my grandma's house tonight. My aunt agrees. By the time my aunt gets her stuff together, the sun is about to go down behind the bluff. Grandma, aunt, and dog all loaded up into the pickup. Grandma turns the key, and nothing. She tries again. Nothing. Not being very mechanically minded, Grandma goes into the house to call Grandpa, but he doesn't answer. She remembers he was going into town this afternoon. Dang. They unload and go back into the house, waiting for Grandpa to get home. It's night now. No moon. Pitch dark. The dog begins to low growl, and the sound of chanting and drums begins, faint at first, but growing louder. My grandma begins to pray in between calling Grandpa. Remember, this is a time before cell phones, and they heard something howl outside. Not a coyote howl, something more ominous and terrifying. Something is moving just beyond the reach of the porch light. Both women are terrified at this point. Finally, after turbo dialing Grandpa, he answers. My grandma is frantic. Elvin, something is outside the house. Get here now. For what seems like hours, they wait for Grandpa's truck to come over the hill. Finally, they see the headlights. Before Grandpa flies into the driveway, something runs across the road in front of him. His headlights illuminate an animal, or something. Grandpa jumps out of the truck, yelling for the woman to get the hell in. He unloads a couple of shots in the general vicinity of the animal. They haul ass down the dirt road towards Grandma's house, and my aunt, against her better judgment, looks back to see red eyes watching her. The next day, my grandpa and uncle head over to the house. Grandpa verified that all around the house, there were bare footprints in the sand, along with very large coyote tracks. Needless to say, my grandma never went back to that house. My aunt won't even talk about it. I made the mistake of staying up too late and listening to the adults talk. My aunt moved in with my grandparents. My grandma swears, though, that she would see those red eyes at night stalking the edge of her property. As far as I know, other people have tried living in Stoddard's house, but leave within a month. The whole area is cursed. I always hated going out there. It's an oppressive evil feeling even at my grandparents'. I'm researching and talking to my Native American friends. I'm fairly certain that my family member had a misfortune of running into a skinwalker. According to the Native Americans in the area, they frequent burial grounds and graveyards, looting and desecrating the sites, as they take pieces of the brains and bodies and grind them into a corpse powder to use in their curses. They're also known to terrorize people away from areas like burials and ruins. When most people think about a haunted place, they imagine a house or abandoned building. But I believe that whole areas can be hotspots for paranormal activity. For me, it would be the land lying to the east of Snowflake, Arizona, and west of Concho, Arizona, along the old Concho Highway. The landscape is that of red rock sandstone ridges and red sand. Ancient Anasazi ruins are numerous along the bluffs. Echoes of time when land wasn't so arid and dry. Gnarled and twisted cedars dot the land along the large dry washes, where sparse groves of cottonwoods grow. My grandparents owned 80 acres of land, about 20 miles east of Snowflake. The locals in Snowflake refer to this area as Out East. My grandparents' mobile home sat on top of a slow-rising hill. About a mile south at the bottom of the hill, my aunt and uncle had built a 3-level home where they lived with their 2 sons and 2 daughters. The house was a neat layout. From the front, it only looked 2 stories, but at the back, due to the slope of the hill, the basement was visible. A large wooden deck surrounded the middle section of the home. The home faced the west, and to the east, the hill slowly descended into a wash. From the back deck, there were views of the Zuni Holy Mountain and Little Colorado River Valley near St. John's, Arizona. This story is the account of the terrifying experience my older cousin Sam endured in the summer of 1991. It was late June. Sam was 17. While most people his age were enjoying their summer vacation, Sam was not. He had attended a huge graduation party and gotten drunk as a skunk. Unfortunately for him, the sheriff's department had also attended the party, and he had received an underage consumption ticket, probation, a severe tongue lashing, and a summer grounding. His mum even took the keys to his pickup he had worked all last summer to buy. There he was, stuck in the middle of the boonies. He had kept pretty busy though, helping out our grandparents who lived up on the hill. After coming home in the late afternoon, he noticed that their neighbor Jeff, from about 5 miles to the west, had stopped to visit with his dad, Bill. Jeff was one of those hippie guys. He was cool and all, but everyone suspected he probably partook in a little too much LSD in the 70s. Jeff had a place on top of the bluff, which ran adjacent to Stoddard's house. Bill and Jeff were on the porch bullshitting when Sam walked up. He said hello to Jeff, and Jeff asked him if Sam would want to help him with a project on his property. He said he'd pay him a couple of $100 for a week or two's worth of work, and Sam agreed. Some party money for when his parents left town next week for their trip to Nebraska with our grandparents. The next morning, Bill gave Sam his keys back so that he could drive over to Jeff's place. When he arrived, Jeff was loading up shovels and equipment into his truck. Sam hadn't asked what they were going to be doing, but assumed after seeing the shovels they were probably going to be replacing fence posts. Jeff told him to hop into the truck, and they headed to the north along the top of the bluff on a barely visible two-road dirt track. The top of the bluff had a good view of the surrounding area. You could see the outskirts of Snowflake, and the big dry wash dotted the cottonwoods to the west. The White Mountains dominated the horizon to the south. To the north, mesas near Hellbrook were visible. To the east were a little valley along a smaller wash. He could make out the roof of Stoddard's house. Stoddard's house, the thought sent a shiver down his spine and gave him goosebumps. He pushed the stories of what happened there to the back of his mind. They went around a small sandstone alcove, and Jeff stopped the truck. In front of them was a large ruin. Sam had grown up out east and had seen many Anasazi ruins. It looked like a large pile of loose sandstone, but a closer look revealed pottery shards everywhere, like almost all of the ruins. This one had large holes where someone had used a backhoe to find pots at some time. Sam got an uneasy feeling. Jeff must have seen his face, because Sam said that he started explaining that his project was to excavate the ruin. He had a grand plan that he was going to excavate the ruin and open a museum on his property of whatever items they found. He'd charge people about $5 to come and check it out. Sam argued that wasn't digging in ruins illegal, and Jeff told him, "Not if you own the property it's on." Sam felt even more uncomfortable. What about angering spirits? Jeff laughed at this. "Are you referring to Stoddard's place?" Sam nodded. "Don't get me wrong, Sam. Your aunt and grandma are nice, honest people. But I didn't think it was Indian spirits. I think they heard rumors in town about what happened to Stoddard, and they freaked themselves out. Besides," he said, "this isn't a burial. There are no bodies here." Sam says now he should have listened to the feeling telling him to leave, but he said he brushed it off and started shoveling. Around noon, Jeff headed over to his house to make Sam and him some lunch. Sam stayed at the ruin. He said he didn't really think much about it at the time, but he noticed it was extremely silent around the ruin. There were no signs or sounds of birds, even no cicadas, which usually around this time of year never shut up. He said on the wind he swore he could hear faint voices, but chalked it up to being freaked out by Stoddard's place being only about a mile away. When Jeff returned with their sandwiches, he also brought a camera, so that they could document their progress and put the photos in the museum. Jeff had Sam take pictures of him in the room that they had cleared out and with the items. So they worked for a week. They weren't making much progress. They hadn't found a lot. A small pot, some beads, and half a matami. Sam was happy to have a day off. All during the week, he had fought the feeling that something bad was going to happen. He was glad to get away from the ruins for a while. He also hadn't been sleeping well. He dreamt one night that his bed had been shaking. After a pretty uneventful weekend, Sam returned to Jeff's house Monday morning. To his surprise, there was a backhoe parked in his driveway, Another neighbor had loaned it to Jeff. Jeff was excited because now they could make more progress. They made a lot of progress. They uncovered 3 to 4 rooms and found some more artifacts. Tuesday and Wednesday go by the same. More rooms, more artifacts, all the while snapping pictures. After filling 4 rolls of film, Jeff takes them to town to be developed. This was way before camera phones and digital cameras, where it took about 10 days to get your pictures developed, by the way. It was now Thursday. They had come across a pretty large room in the pueblo. In the middle is a large block of sandstone. This piqued Jeff's curiosity. The rest of the sandstone they had come across was small. Using the backhoe, he moved the sandstone to the side. There was a black hole beneath. Something about that black hole made Sam's stomach knot. Jeff was extremely excited. He looked into the hole, but was unable to make anything out. He grabbed a flashlight and shined it into the hole. "It's another room," Jeff exclaimed. Sam didn't want to look. Something about that opening made his skin crawl. Jeff told Sam to run and grab a ladder. He did as he was told, hoping Jeff wasn't going to ask him to go in there. Thunder rolled in the distance as he headed back to the ruin. Monsoon clouds were building up in the south, and the wind had picked up. Jeff put the ladder down into the opening. Sam asked him if it was safe, and Jeff figured that since the room had been filled with dirt and the giant slab of sandstone for 1,000 years, he didn't reckon the roof would collapse now. Jeff descended the ladder with a flashlight. "Holy shit," he heard Jeff exclaim. He called to Sam, who slowly made his way over. "Bring the camera and come down." Sam felt terror grip him. He really didn't want to go back down there, but he also didn't want Jeff to think he was a chicken shit either. He grabbed the camera and descended into the black pit. At first he couldn't see anything. It's black, very black. And then he saw the beam of Jeff's flashlight, shining on a large corrugated pot. Even with the sunlight coming down the opening, it wasn't able to penetrate the darkness. Finally it dawned upon Sam that the walls and floors were black. The air was stale, and it smelled strongly of soot. Jeff was excitedly moving around the room to see all the treasures it held. A long roll of thunder boomed in the distance. "Start taking pictures?" Jeff exclaimed, annoyed that Sam was just standing there. "Make sure the flash is on." Sam began to snap photos. The flash illuminated the room briefly, and after about the 3rd photo, Sam caught a glimpse of something that made him jump. A human skull. Heat pounding in his chest, he squeaked out, "Jeff, there's a skull." Jeff, busily looking over there, didn't hear him. He snapped another photo just to be sure. "Yup, definitely a skull." But he still didn't get heard. So Sam said louder, "Jeff, there's a skull." "What? Oh yeah, a skull. There's a few of them down here. Looks like there was a fire in this room." He kicked one across the room towards Sam, and Sam jumped. "What the hell, man?" Sam said, his fear turning into anger. "Dude, this isn't right. You shouldn't be messing with bodies. We need to call the cops or something." Jeff laughed. "Call the cops? And tell them what? We found a bunch of 1,000-year-old dead Indians?" Sam was now really pissed. "Listen, Jeff, if you want to mess around with this stuff, be my guest. I'm done. There's something bad about this place and I'm leaving." Again, Jeff laughed. "You're scared of a bunch of bones? Whatever, man, go. I'm not paying your ass to be a crybaby." Sam tossed Jeff's camera to the ground and climbed up the ladder, and Jeff started cussing at the broken camera. Sam didn't care, though he started walking back to Jeff's house, where his truck was parked. The wind was blowing pretty hard now. Black clouds covered the sun. Sam now saw flashes of lightning, along with the thunder. When he arrived home, he remembered that my aunt and uncle had left along with his sisters on their trip to Nebraska. His older brother Zach was also gone at work at Pizza Hut for the evening. He was tired. He lay down on the couch and fell asleep, trying not to think about the black room full of bones. A loud crack of thunder shook the house and jolted Sam awake. The house was dark. He fumbled his way to the light switch and flipped it on. Nothing. A flash of lightning illuminated the room. Damn, the storm must have knocked the power out. The wind was howling outside. He fumbled around in the closet until he found the lantern and lit it. He still felt extremely creeped out, so he went up to his bedroom where he had a joint stashed. He figured if he smoked it, it would help with his nerves. His bedroom faces the driveway. He opens up his window and goes to light the joint. A flash of lightning and something darts across the driveway, and his heart skips a beat. The dogs start barking. He puts down the joint and closes the window. He feels terror gnawing at his gut. What the hell was that? He goes downstairs as a precaution and locks the front sliding door. He hears heavy footsteps running across the porch. Now he goes into full-on panic mode. Shit. The side door. He bolts across the living room and trips over a chair. The dogs are freaking out, growling and barking. He catches a glimpse of something run by the living room window, illuminated by the flash of lightning. He gets to the door, fumbling at the lock. Whatever is outside has a hold of the knob. It starts to turn. He slams the deadbolt. Locked. Shit. The basement sliding glass door. He bolts down the stairs. He makes it to the door, finding it already locked. Phew. Another lightning bolt. In the flash, he sees the silhouette of what he thinks is a man, covered with fur, with a coyote skin draped over his head. Red eyes shining from the darkness where his face should be, standing at the edge of the yard. It's very tall. Looking into those red shining eyes, his breath caught in his throat. Panic wells up in him. Scrabbling, he falls backwards, knocking his head on a table. Crying, he gets up to his feet and bolts upstairs to the phone. Call 911. Call 911. His heart is hammering into his brain. He picks up the phone. Nothing. A large thud, coming from the roof, shakes him from his despair. The thing is on the roof. Shit. Gun. Gun. That comes to mind. He bolts to his parents' bedroom, where they keep a shotgun in the closet. The dogs bound in after him. It begins to start pouring rain. He can still hear the footsteps on the roof. He locks the door behind him. He's going into the closet, and the dogs follow him. He finds the shotgun, his hands shaking like crazy, and he loads it. The dogs are quiet. He can't hear anything coming from the roof anymore. Where the hell is it? In the house? He sits in the closet and waits. The dogs huddled around him. What seems like an hour passes, and nothing but the distant boom of thunder as the storm marches on. He begins to calm down a bit in shock. At this point, the storm has rolled to the north. Suddenly he hears the door rattling. Bang, bang. It's beating on the door. Boom. The shotgun goes off, blowing a hole in the closet ceiling, and someone's screaming. Don't shoot! He hears his brother Zach scream. Tears run down Sam's face. He drops the gun and runs to the door, unlocking it. almost knocking over his brother. Zach is pissed. "What the hell, man? Why are you shooting at me?" Sam is in a daze. The story of what happened earlier in that day, and this evening, spews out of him. Zach listens, not saying a word. At the end, Zach asks him, "Okay, Sam, what did you smoke?" "Nothing. I'm not high, bro." Zach laughs at him. "Okay, but Mum is going to be pissed. Not only because you blew a huge hole in their closet, but also all the mud tracks all over the place. You better get it cleaned up." "What mud? And how did Zach get in? The house was locked." He asked Zach, and Zach tells him that the sliding glass door was wide open. The electricity had come back on at some point while he was in the closet. True to what Zach said, there were red mud bare footprints around the house. It wasn't him. He showed Zach his shoes, bare feet, and that the prints were way larger than his feet. David agreed. "I bet it was Jeff," Zach concluded. "He probably came over to mess with you because he's pissed you quit and busted his camera. He knew you were freaked out, so he thought he'd mess with you." Sam wasn't sure, but it made him feel slightly better. "Yeah," he tells himself. "Jeff, that asshole. I must not have got the latch to the sliding door closed. The noise on the roof must have been the wind blowing shingles off the roof." It began to all make sense. He and Zach drank a couple of beers that their dad had left in the fridge. They cleaned the mud to the best of their abilities, and after getting buzzed, they decided that they were going to go over in the morning and confront Jeff. Zach says he needed to pay Sam an extra since they now needed to rent a carpet shampooer to clean the mess that Jeff made. Finally, they decide to go into town. One of their friends is throwing a party. I don't think either one of them wanted to stay out there. The party is one that's out in the boonies, with a big bonfire. There are about 20 teens there. Sam is having a hard time enjoying the party. He keeps feeling like something is watching him. The beer isn't tasting good, and he's not really socializing with his friends. They ask him what's wrong, but he just says he's tired. The full moon is rising to the east, casting its eerie light in the sandstone bluffs and cedars. Sam gazes past the firelight and catches a glimpse of something moving just out of the reach of the firelight. It moves behind a bush. Must be someone peeing, he thinks to himself. But his gut is disagreeing. Suddenly a strange, throaty howl pierces the night. Sam jumps. He looks around, but no one else seems to have heard anything. They continue laughing and talking. He now hears heaving footprints behind him. He turns to see a large figure of a man standing just outside the firelight. He is paralyzed with fear. The man's face is hidden in shadow, but Sam can feel his eyes piercing him. He closes his eyes and starts whispering a prayer under his breath. When he has the courage to open his eyes, the man is gone. He's pretty freaked out at this point and just wants to get out of there, and he tells Zach he's going home. Zach decides to stay. Sam doesn't really want to go home, and he also doesn't want to go back to the party. Mind racing, he heads down east to the old Concho Highway. Surely, he thinks to himself, he is just freaking himself out. Jeff came over and scared him, and that person at the party was probably just someone who was out there peeing. Yeah, makes sense. He notices something run across the highway. It's about 2 a.m, so the highway is deserted. He slows down, thinking it must have been a deer. Crash! Something hits the back of his truck, jerking it forward. What the hell? He slams on the brakes, looking in the rearview mirror. He catches a glimpse of shining eyes. He is in full panic mode. He stomps on the gas. Sheer terror engulfs him, Too afraid to look back, he sees something out of the corner of his eye. He turns to look and sees a man running next to the truck. He looks at the speed, 70. He looks again, and now the coyote-type creature is looking at him. At first, its face is shrouded in blackness, and then he said it transformed before his eyes. The only way he could describe it was that of a demon. Large red eyes and a twisted smile showing long, sharp teeth. It threw back its head and laughed. It took a long clawed hand and scratched along the truck as it sped past and disappeared into the darkness. So this is what I remember. We lived about 2 hours away from Snowflake. I'm 7 years old in my bed. At 3 a.m., our family is awakened by someone pounding on the door. Of course, this wakes up everyone, including us kids, as we watch as my dad opens the door to see my cousin Sam. He's white as a ghost, shaking and crying. My parents pretty damn startled, trying to figure out what the hell is going on. He starts babbling about demons chasing him, and my mum sends us back to bed. The next day, my dad calls a Navajo friend, and they take him somewhere near Saunders to see a medicine man. After they return, Sam stayed with us until his parents returned from Nebraska. When he finally goes home, he never sees anything again. Years later, when I was older, and we became closer, I asked him what happened that night, the one that he'd shown up at the house, and he reluctantly told me. I later asked my parents about it, and they confirmed the same story he had told them, minus one final part. So the morning that Sam showed up at our house, Zach and his older brother went to Jeff's house to collect Sam's money. When he got there, Jeff wasn't there. The door to the house was wide open. The inside was trashed. Furniture was overturned and broken. Jeff ended up being gone for about 6 months. Everyone wondered where he had gone to. No one really knew anything about his family, just that they were from the Midwest. At one point, my grandma filed a missing persons report with the sheriff's office, but later the sheriff informed her that Jeff was back east. When he does finally return, he is gaunt and looks like he's aged about 20 years. Everyone wonders if it was the drugs. Fast forward to 5 or 6 years. My grandparents invite Jeff to Thanksgiving at their home. Sam has graduated and long since moved away, but he is up for Thanksgiving. Jeff asks Sam to come to his truck because he has something to show him. Sam agrees. Jeff hands him a stack of photos. They are the pictures they had taken while excavating the ruins. Sam flicks through, not really wanting to think of what happened back then. In the last few years, he convinced himself it was just a bunch of coincidences, and he freaked himself out over them. Jeff unhappily tells Sam to look at the pictures closer. Sam does. At first, he doesn't notice anything, but then he notices in the shadows on the picture, there are figures, small, twisted, and evil, with the same face of the demon that was chasing him. Jeff apologizes to Sam, but he says that he had to make sure he wasn't crazy. He tells Sam that in the 6 months he was gone, he was hunted by this thing. It followed him all the way to Oklahoma. Finally, he sought the help of a medicine man. He returned the artifacts back to fill the ruin, and Sam said he didn't know what happened to the photos, and he didn't want to know. Something about being in the woods has always fascinated me. I found myself on an expedition deep within the forest. To be more precise, High Peaks Wilderness, which is an area within the Adirondacks. I brought along a buddy of mine, but you can call him Trail Master, and a friend of mine who we'll refer to as Nymph. The trails here are endless. Beautiful mountain ranges filled with mile after mile of dense forest. A true definition of beautiful and dangerous. After hiking for most of the day, we must have travelled under 3.5 miles. Trail Master found a good spot for us to settle down for the night. A slight breeze blew from the northeast as the sun was on the verge of setting. We estimated 2.5 hours of daylight remaining. Trail Master went out to gather wood, and Nymph went to collect water from a nearby creek. I worked on setting up our 3 tents for the night. All of a sudden, Nymph came running back to camp without the canteens. The sound of her panting, followed by her dropping to the dirt on her knees, was enough to leave me in awe. Believe me when I say I know Nymph. It's unusual for her to be panting that loud. Nymph? I did my best to calm her down, trying to get answers. What's the matter? I asked her. Just as Trail Master returned with a bundle of sticks. What's wrong with her? He asked. This is what Nymph told us. She had just arrived at the creek and found a good spot. She was just filling up, and the cliché sound of a twig snapping was what she heard. The sound wasn't enough to startle her, but rather the events that followed. The sound originated from the other side of the creek. She brushed it aside as an animal, probably spooked by her presence, and kept filling it. Then she heard it again, except the sound was louder and seemed much closer this time. It caught her by surprise, and she was forced by instinct to look at the direction that the sound came from. What she heard next was an audible grunting sound, the type a white-tailed male deer might make. The feeling of dread washed upon her. She felt as though she shouldn't have been there. Followed by the sudden feeling of being watched, it made her extremely uncomfortable, almost to the point of disorient. She rose to her feet, took a few steps back, and what she then saw across the creek, obstructed by trees, only a tall pair of antlers and what looked like legs, hind legs, followed by loud grunting. She thought it could have been a deer, but her better judgment kicked in, and she thought to herself, what deer isn't afraid of humans being so close? She ran back to camp, where the grunts became louder and started sounding almost threatening. Are you sure? Trail Master asked, with a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Nymph didn't even answer him. Instead, shot him a cold stare. It was most likely a deer. Are you afraid of deer? Said Trail Master. I, on the other hand, gave Nymph the benefit of the doubt. Nymph, even in her current state, was capable of describing what she saw, heard, and felt. It was her senses and a gut feeling that made her run away. Trail Master opted to go look into the area where Nymph had previously been. Nymph was reluctant and said she would not be going back. So Trail Master set out alone. Nymph stayed at camp with myself, who was debating on whether we needed to relocate our camp. I needed a report before the decision could be made. When Trail Master arrived at the area of the creek where Nymph had been, this is what he observed. Footprints, which were most likely Nymph's, heading in the direction of our camp. Empty canteens on the ground, and on the other side of the creek, there were prints resembling an animal, perhaps a deer. The only problem was the spacing of the prints, and how something about them appeared missing. A deer typically walks on all fours. Upon closer inspection, Trail Master came up with the conclusion that this deer had probably been walking on its hind legs. The prints formed a trail. The trail seemed to have emerged from somewhere in the woods, continue for a few meters, and stop at the opposite edge of the creek, then turn around and head back in the direction from where they originated from. without overlapping the original set. Trailmaster later admitted that it did spook him, and he too had had this uneasy feeling. He arrived back at camp half an hour later with our filled canteens. Even if we wanted to move, it would be nearly impossible as the sun had already begun to set. Fast forward 2.5 hours, our tents were pitched, campfire lit, and dinners served. We decided that it was best for one of us to be awake at all times until first light. It was just too dark to move at the moment. My tent was only a foot away from Nymph's tent. There was a good reason for that. Trailmaster's tent had been pitched a good 5 meters away because he was a light sleeper. We had to move his tent back closer to ours. The perimeter of our camp was set with a tarp, which would sound if someone tripped the wire. Some tin cans and fishing line, primitive but effective. Nymph didn't say much about the incident that night, and I don't blame her. She was still a bit shaken from the incident, though I would keep her safe. Trailmaster's findings at the creek only raised uncertainty. Thinking about what Nymph saw and what the Trailmaster found made me uneasy. The darkness around us, followed by the eerie silence of the woods and the uncertainty of what was out there, was unsettling. The sound of burning wood was the only sound loud enough to distract us from sudden faint sounds in the distance. The mind can play tricks on you. That night, it seemed like a dark figure was always standing a few meters outside of our camp, beyond the reach of the fire's light. Every rustle in the bush was something trying to sneak up on us. Every sound had a source. It's those sounds that make a night in the woods so magical. Trailmaster and Nymph were asleep. I was on watch. The sounds of crickets at night is nature's lullaby, which was on the verge of putting me to sleep, when all of a sudden, it stopped. Insert musical cue. I had fallen asleep while on watch. Nymph said that she had awoken sometime during the early hours of the morning, around 4 a.m. She found both myself and Trailmaster out. The air outside the tent was filled with a putrid smell. She described it as rotting flesh that just seemed to linger. A week-old carcass already in the stages of decomposition. It was that bad. Nymph, alarmed by the smell, woke both of us up. We obviously had not smelled anything hours before. I did a perimeter check and found nothing unusual. We did feel as if we were being watched, which is an overwhelming feeling. The smell faded within the hour, after we started making some noise. It was only during first light, about 2 hours later, did we notice it. Prints from what I assumed to be a deer just a few meters away. Trailmaster confirmed that these prints were identical to the ones he had found by the creek yesterday. It could have just been a random deer in the night, Trailmaster said. Though what I found unusual was the way the prints had seemed to pace back and forth horizontally, then head in a vertical direction. Trailmaster said they seemed to be missing a pair again, meaning it was just hind legs from the looks of it. I have to agree, because these prints seemed odd. The prints were definitely of a deer. What bothered us was the zigzag pattern of the vertical prints, which was strikingly similar to how a human might walk. Trailmaster was tempted to follow the set of prints, which headed in another direction. Nymph was hysterical and had no intention of doing such things. She said that the whole ordeal just seemed odd and downright creepy. A deer creature, weird prints, and not to mention the stench? Was this thing stalking us? We had no intention to find out. I urged Trailmaster to forget about it, that we needed to keep on moving. Third time's the charm, I told Trailmaster. Let's not be around for it. We were on the move for most of the day. Nymph still felt overwhelmed with dread, and Trailmaster did not experience the same feelings, hence why he opted to go investigate the prince before. He seemed fine being on point. Nymph admitted how she thought the creature was following us. I told her to stay close. I don't know what made her think that, but I knew better than to doubt her. If the creature had been following us, it probably followed at a distance. Nothing would be more terrifying than to suddenly turn around and see a pair of antlers sticking out from a tree behind, or for one of us to be singled out in the middle of nowhere. Despite all that happened, we managed to reach our destination unscathed. All seemed quiet. Any and all feelings of dread vanished as well as the feeling of being watched. The atmosphere felt lighter as we moved out the area. Perhaps we were in its territory, so it felt the need to make its presence known. We no longer felt threatened, and nothing else significant happened that's worth mentioning. Reflection. We got lucky on that trip. Perhaps the creature decided to spare us. Maybe it meant no harm. We simply don't know. So many questions with very few answers. I'm not 100% sure what it was that we encountered out there, though one name does come to mind the more I think about it. The Wendigo. I've heard stories about the existence of this creature from folklore. I've managed to remain a skeptic until now. Whatever that creature was, I'd like to think that it's still out there, waiting for the next group of hikers who venture off the trail into the vast unknown. Be careful next time you're out there in the woods. This is a story my family told me when I was growing up. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her two brothers were home alone, while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and my uncle were getting ready for bed. Outside they heard noises, as if someone were moving things around outside. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary, because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left out in the vehicle. My aunt and uncle were frightened by this sight and knew that they should take action. They took out their rifles and all steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the doors and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and walked towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong, it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off in the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked towards the lights and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran towards the truck with a gun. My grandfather got out the car and pointed at the tree. The thing was poking out its head to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes, rubbed them over his gun, and placed an ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch, fired towards the tree, and whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed, and the dark figure began running. My grandma chased my aunt inside, and my uncles and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, and so my grandfather and uncle chased after the figure. The truck was bouncing, and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever their headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. Not only that, whoever it was running ran on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that dropped about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her and to leave his family alone. A few days passed, and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told if you know who the Skinwalker is, say their name, and it will kill them. My cousin lived in the eastern agency of the Navajo Nation, in a community known as Crow Point. She was still living with her parents at this time, and was a good girl. She had good grades, a nice ride, and was very popular and played on the basketball team. When she told us this story, it was very out of the ordinary, and the events that followed would also deepen my beliefs in the traditional Navajo way and the taboos associated with the Navajo culture. My cousin was coming home from basketball practice, which ran past sunset. It was during the colder months, and so it was dark by the time she pulled into her neighborhood. She pulled into the small housing community that she lived in. It was far from a fenced community, but there were streetlights, and the neighborhoods weren't too far from each other. And as she neared her home, she saw a group of dogs. This wasn't unlikely, as there were a random pack of stray dogs that roamed rural communities. These dogs didn't belong to anyone, and they got food wherever they could get it. As she got closer, she noticed that something was off about the dogs. There were 4 dogs, and they were sitting in a circle all facing each other. This really didn't faze her until she spoke about the event later. Because this was a housing community, my cousin couldn't barrel down the road, so she drove slowly past the group of dogs and kept going on her way. As she continued to drive, she noticed in her peripheral vision that something was running alongside her car. She turned her head to see that a brown dog from the group was trotting alongside her car. She didn't mind until she was hit by a strategically placed speed bump. The impact of the bump made her entire car wobble. She looked over at the dog again, still casually keeping pace with the car. She tried to ignore the dog and tried speeding up, keeping in mind where the speed bumps were placed. The dog continued to keep pace. My cousin had to eventually stop at a bus sign. She began to feel immensely uncomfortable and tried to keep her eyes forward, but curiosity got the better of her. She looked over at the dog. It was facing forwards. She continued to stare, and that is when the dog turned its head. Instead of the face of a dog, there was the flat face of a man covered in hair and smiling from ear to ear. Fear shot through her body. My cousin pushed the pedal to the floor, not daring to look back in her rearview mirror. She reached her house and barely pulled herself into the door, weak from fear. My aunt came to her, and my cousin began to sob. She told my aunt everything, and they scheduled a meeting with a medicine man the next day. That night, when my cousin was trying to get some rest, she was tossing and turning and felt very ill. She could hear people laughing outside and speaking in Navajo, but she didn't think too much of it because she lived in a community near plenty of neighbors. At the medicine man, he told my cousin that she was very fortunate. The Skinwalker wasn't meant for her. She just happened to spot it while it was out to bring another person misfortune. He also told her that the laughing and the talking she had heard in the night was the Skinwalker talking to his friends, letting them know that someone had seen him and that he had scared her. The medicine man told my cousin that if the Skinwalker had been there for her and she had seen him like that, it could have very well killed her. After that encounter, my cousin suffered from many ailments and had to stop playing basketball for a while. She had many ceremonies and eventually got back to her feet. My mum told us this story on the many nights that our electricity went out. When I asked my cousin about it, she confirms it to be true, although she doesn't like talking about it much. Out on the Navajo reservation, we don't have the city come and collect our trash, so we burn our trash in these huge burning barrels. Not very eco-friendly, I know, but that's what we've got to do. If you don't light the trash properly, the fire will go out and sit in the barrel. This is important because we are told to dispose of personal hygiene items correctly. If you removed all your hair from your brush, make sure the trash burned. If it was that time of the month, make sure that trash burned. If you changed a baby's diaper, make sure the trash burned. They tell us these things because skinwalkers have been known to dig through the trash in order to find things that they can use against us. They use the things that we were briefly connected to bring misfortune to us using these items. Some of my family members take part in the sport of rodeo, so to practice, they have a roping dummy and take turns roping it. My 2 male cousins were enjoying themselves outside and taking turns swinging the rope at the fake calf. The elders are always adamant that we shouldn't stay out past sundown, especially on the res, where it's pitch black and no one is around for miles. But my cousins aren't the superstitious type, and they were under the streetlight. My cousins are joking and laughing, having a great time, and that changes when my eldest cousin looks over to the burn barrel. A dark figure is bent over and rummaging through the garbage that failed to burn. My cousins devise a plan that they're going to grab a weapon, sticks and rocks and go chase whatever it is. They move strategically so that they are able to flank the figure. They run at full speed at it and begin yelling and swinging their sticks and throwing their rocks. My cousin stated that they kept up with it for the most part. That was until the figure ran under the streetlight. What my cousin thought was it was probably a person or a goat. Why would they think that it was a person though? Because the goat was running on its hind legs. They stopped running and fear ran down their backs as the figure ran off into the dark. Feeling nervous and not entirely accepting what they'd just seen, they began roping the dummy again. There was an awkward silence amongst the boys now. They just saw something unnatural, but talking about it now would make it seem real. Were they crazy? Did they really see a skinwalker? The boys roped the dummy in silence until one of them looked over to the tree. There was a head peeking out at them. If they didn't pay attention to it, whatever it was would poke its head out from behind the tree and stare. When they would look in the direction of the tree, it would quickly move back and out of sight. This was the final straw, and my cousins ran back into the house. They told their parents, and my uncle came out to look. It was still there, poking its head out and going back behind the tree. My uncle loaded his gun and started walking towards it. He aimed and pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The gun jammed. Whatever it was began to run, but it was so fast, like a blur, as my cousins describe it. When it left, my uncle came in and gave the boys a thorough lecture on staying out late. The next day, my cousin told my uncle that whatever it was had been digging through the trash barrel. They went to investigate, and the creature had pulled a lot of things out the barrel. What was odd was the tracks. Goat prints were all around the area. They followed the set of tracks, and they found a baby diaper several feet away from the barrel. Whatever they saw that night had a very malevolent intention. My cousins say that although the sight was ungodly, they know what they saw and stand by their claim. The Navajo Reservation is the largest reservation in the US. It goes into New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, and Arizona. This story takes place in the northeastern region of Arizona, near Indian Wells. This was told by people from around that area. If you're heading west on State Highway 15, out towards Dilken, you come to a stretch of road that goes into a small valley. I remember going down this road in my youth. If you looked at the horizon, it would seem as if the road kept going. Then suddenly, your car would be pulled down by gravity as you followed the road. It would always give me butterflies when we would go down this slope. When I heard the story about this road, it made my stomach feel different. A man was driving home one night, and it was very late. It was a drive that he had done before, so he wasn't too bothered by it. When you are driving on the reservation, sometimes there isn't any way to keep cattle from getting on the road. No fences means that you need to be extra aware. I was always told to look for the black horse. If you see a black horse, then you'll be able to see anything else that may wander in front of the path of your vehicle. So this man is driving home, not paying too much attention, and he drives down the slope. But as soon as he gets to the bottom of the valley, he sees it, but doesn't have enough time to react. Suddenly a horse comes out of the darkness. He slams on his brakes, but is unable to stop and hits the horse with his truck. The impact was not enough to deploy the airbags, but the man was tossed around quite a bit by the incident. He turns on his emergency lights, then gets out of the car to assess the damage. The front of the car was crumpled, and one of the headlights was destroyed. He cursed out loud. This was one of the worst places to have an accident, and he didn't have a signal to phone for help. Then he remembered the horse. The man went into the cab of his truck, got out a small keychain flashlight, and started shining around looking for the wounded animal. He heard noises, but they didn't sound like a horse. He was positive that he had hit a horse. As he approached the sounds, he could see the animal's fur moving from its ragged breathing. As he got closer, he began to realize what it was. It was a naked elderly woman, wrapped in a large pelt. She was moaning from pain. The man stopped dead in his tracks and got weak from fear. He stumbled back to his truck, and although he suffered plenty of damage, he was able to get it started and drove off. Once he was able to get signal, he called the authorities. An ambulance drove out there and recovered the woman. She was driven to a local healthcare facility. Due to the fact that many of the healthcare staff were Navajo, no one wanted to touch her. The woman was known in the community, and she was thought to be bedridden. This was shocking, because she was so far from home, and the state she was in was immensely off-putting. She still had on her attire when she arrived at the hospital. The nurses called her family to come in. When the family got there, they removed her pelt and her jewelry. The staff were very frightened, but there were some non-Navajo staff that still provided her with care. The elderly woman only had bumps and scraps. Other than that, she seemed fine. She was able to get up and walk around that same evening. She went home with her family that night, but after a couple of days, she had passed. In the Navajo culture, if you find out who a Skinwalker is, you have the power to destroy them. After the community around Indian Wells found out who, or more fittingly, what this woman was, it was for certain that her time was at an end. In the traditional Navajo way, skinwalkers are seen as witches, but they weren't always seen that way. My late grandmother, who was a medicine woman that practiced the blessings way, told me the origins of the skinwalker. Being a skinwalker wasn't always seen as a bad thing. In fact, they were seen as people with amazing gifts. They could change into the form of any animal, run vast distances very quickly, mimic people's voices, and some were known to use magic. During colonization, skinwalker were used to relay messages between war camps and spy on enemies without being detected. Having the skinwalker abilities was a gift. When we lost, the good of the community took a step back, and people began to focus on themselves instead of sharing what you had. People began to look after their own families, claiming properties and livestock, and there were people that got the short end of the stick. Jealousy is a terrible thing. People became jealous of one another and wanted more fortunate people to lose what they had. They looked to skinwalkers, who had otherworldly powers, to do their bidding. Now, being a skinwalker is not a gift. You condemn yourself to a life of unhappiness and anger. In order to become a skinwalker, you must sacrifice someone that you love very, very much. This shows that you are indeed committed to depravity. The interesting thing is that you could have met a skinwalker and not even known it. They are people just like you or I that have chosen the path which will hurt others. Navajos want to separate themselves from death of any kind. We burn clothing and personal items of deceased relatives, and it is very taboo to keep anything that belongs to the dead. Keeping such items can make a person sick or suffer horrible events in their life. However, skinwalkers surround themselves with death. Skinwalkers have been known to grave rob and search through people's garbage. They use bones and hair from the dead and victims' personal items to create bundles. They place these bundles near a person's home, and bad luck will fall upon them. So, back to the story. My oldest sister marches to the beat of her own drum, and this story is about her. In her younger days, my sister was very much interested in the rodeo scene. My family actually had a pretty impressive legacy when it comes to the sport. My sisters didn't compete, but had plenty of friends and family that would let them go and watch. My two sisters would travel around the Southwest, following the rodeo circuit. The cowboy lifestyle isn't always glamorous, and it can be filled with alcoholism, drugs, and depression. Unfortunately, this took hold of my sister, and she got in trouble with the law. My sister was looking at jail time, and the family was very concerned about what might happen to her. This was very out of the ordinary. My mother went to a local medicine man, and they talked about the next steps, and they decided to have a ceremony for my older sister. A few days passed, and it was time for the ceremony. The medicine man and his wife showed up a little past dusk. They came into our house, and we served them food that we had prepared. Everyone chatted for a bit, and when we finished eating and cleaned up, it was time to start. Everyone sat down in the living room in a large circle. The medicine man sat on the far west side of the room. My oldest sister sat to his left. In the middle of the circle was a large pile of sand that was smoothed on the top. My uncle got his coals from the fire and placed them on the sand. The medicine man prayed in Navajo and sang blessing songs. This went on into the night. At the height of the ceremony, the medicine man turned to my older sister and told her that they should go outside and pray in the darkness. He told her to not look around as he was singing, and told her to keep her eyes on him. The medicine man, my sister, and my uncle went outside. The medicine man turned around and began singing into the darkness. My sister was watching him sing, trying to keep her focus on only him. Then she heard it. Off in the distance, she heard someone whistle. This made her feel sick to the stomach. Our elders tell us that our culture taboos start at a young age. One of the biggest things that they stress is to never whistle at night. They tell us the dead whistle at night. So when my sister heard whistling out in the darkness, fear gripped her heart. She was so scared that tears began to well up in her eyes. The whistling got ever louder, as if whatever it was moving closer and closer. My uncle was also outside during the prayer, and he admits that he was scared too, but he wanted to be there for my sister. What my uncle saw was even more miraculous. He claims that as the medicine man sang, a bundle came from up above. The eagle feathers that the medicine man was holding opened up like a hand. The bundle gently floated down into the feathers, and the feathers closed around the bundle. The medicine man stopped singing, and the group went back into the house. My sister stumbled in, clearly shaken by the experience. The medicine man could now see how my sister was. She asked him what was whistling. He told her that it was a skinwalker, and that he was trying to call the bundle back. We gathered around to see what was in the bundle. The medicine man opened up to see what looked to be a leather pouch. Inside it was a bone about 1 inch wide and 3 inches long. Upon closer inspection, the bone was hollowed out, and more items were shoved inside of the bone and placed inside the bag with twigs and dirt. He dissected the bone to find hair on a piece of shirt, both belonging to my sister, and a very tiny drawing of a woman behind bars. Whatever was calling out to this bundle had very ill intentions for my sister. Fortunately, after the ceremony, all of my sister's charges were dismissed. I asked my sister what they did with the bundle, and she says that she wasn't really sure. She says that she vividly remembers being very scared when they were standing outside. My sister controls her emotions very well, and so I can't even begin to fathom how scared she must have felt in that moment. Personally, I find it hard to believe that these events are merely coincidental. This incident occurred sometime in the fall of '06. I grew up in a rural part of Ohio. My house had fairly dense wood located directly behind it. As a child, I had a passion for exploring. I especially loved exploring those woods. It was my favorite place to be. Prior to the incident, I had wandered through these woods many times, always with my mother's permission. There was one tree in particular that I frequently enjoyed to climb. Usually, about the halfway mark, I would perch myself on one of the heavier branches and just relax as I listened to the peaceful sounds of nature. Climbing that tree for the very first time was quite an accomplishment. From that position, I could partially see the back of my house. On that day, after a fair amount of exploring, I carefully scaled my favorite tree. I seated myself on a sturdy branch and took in the view. Naturally, being late in October, the sun inevitably began to set within a few minutes. I always felt a little saddened to see the darkness approaching. The woods were like my own little sanctuary. I could entertain myself out there for hours. When the darkness began to fall, however, my mother would stand at the edge of the woods and call my name until I obediently returned home, so not to be stranded out there after dark. After watching the sunset until I could no longer see it, I began my descent down the trees. I was nearly at the bottom when I heard my mother's familiar voice calling my name. I thought nothing of it at first, as this routine had occurred plenty of times before. Then I realized something strange at my feet touched the ground. My mother's voice was coming from behind me, deeper in the woods, rather than the entrance to where she always stood and where she called me home. My mother had never entered these woods before, at least not with me. I was eager to find her and show her all of my favorite spots before it grew too dark. That's when I realized something was off. How could she have got into the woods ahead of me? Certainly I could have missed her. But as I said, she's never entered these woods. She continued calling my name, but there was something strange about it. She sounded absolutely frantic, almost angry. Fearing that I was in trouble for reasons currently unknown, I froze in place. As her voice drew closer, I squinted my eyes to see if I could locate her and determine exactly how angry or upset she appeared to be. However, I didn't see anyone or anything unusual. Suddenly I heard her voice calling my name from the direction of my house, sounding much calmer. Seconds later, from somewhere within the woods yet again. It wasn't an echo. I wasn't imagining things. I was literally hearing her beckoning me from the edge of our backyard as well as ahead of me. My legs suddenly turned to jelly. I couldn't quite comprehend what was going on. "Come here right now." The voice that I originally believed to be her screamed from just ahead. I realized that whoever or whatever was mimicking my mother was drawing closer. I didn't question which voice was actually my mother's, as there was something about the way it sounded that unnerved me. Terrified of what I would see if I stood there much longer, I turned around and ran towards the exit of the woods as quickly as my legs could possibly carry me. It was amazing that I didn't trip over anything in my haste, even though my house wasn't very far away from where I had been standing. Those woods had never seemed larger to me than they did at that moment. From behind me, my mother's voice continued to call my name, now sounding desperate. Panic set in as my actual mother finally came into view, waiting patiently as she usually did until I returned home. In my frightened state, I absolutely refused to look back. As soon as I was out of the woods and in the backyard next to my mother, the other voice was suddenly gone. Rather than fading away, it seemed to stop the very moment I stepped foot into my backyard. I must have looked as frightened as I felt, because my mother asked me what was wrong. Slowly but surely, my panic subsided. I didn't say anything until we were safely inside the house, with our doors locked. I asked my mother if she had entered the woods. Appearing confused by the question, she told me that of course she had not. With that confirmation, I hesitantly asked her if she had heard anyone else calling my name and yelling. The answer to that question was no. Although I was still very much shaken up, I managed to explain everything that happened as clearly and rationally as possible. My mother was surprised and nonchalant about the whole situation, explaining that I must have just imagined it, and that I was spending way too much time out there by myself. The incident in those woods have stayed with me to this day. I can still hear that voice as clear as a bell. Whoever or whatever it was calling my name, sounded exactly like my mother. But I know it wasn't her. Not only was she waiting for me outside, but the voice also sounded strange, in a way that I cannot fully explain. I didn't go back into the woods until I was 17 years old, and even then, I never hung out for very long. I've carefully gone over every possible explanation, but none of them seem entirely plausible. It certainly wasn't my mother playing a prank. There was no way she could have pulled it off. Not to mention the fact that she's never been one to play pranks. I also highly doubt that it was anyone else, because as I stated before, we lived in a rural area. The closest neighbor was at least a mile away, and I wasn't personally acquainted with any of them. How could they have known my name, as well as where to find me? We have since moved out of that house, but my mother and I will occasionally discuss the incident. She still claims that she never heard or saw anything unusual out there. I know I probably shouldn't, but what happened in these woods continues to bother me. I spent many hours out there prior to that day, and never had anything out of the ordinary occur. The best explanation I have at this point is a doppelganger, or possibly a demon. I'm not sure. If anyone has any possible explanations for what might have happened, I would love to hear them. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I'm gonna be honest, I think that this might be... No, I'm just gonna say it. I think these are the best Skinwalker stories I've ever read. Legit, seriously, some of the best stories I've ever read in general, to be honest. Top notch. I'm adding this to my playlist, The Best of Mort, which, if you're new and you haven't checked out, contains some of the very best stories I've ever read. And you know, I really do recommend it. I don't add videos there often, but when I do, it means that they are the creme de la creme. So, feel free to check that out. Yeah, this video was really good. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I hope you liked the extra length. I know most of you guys appreciate it. I've been dropping a lot of long content lately. But anyway, I'm sure you guys are fine with it. If you would do me the favor of leaving a like and a comment, that really would mean a lot. And if you're new, again, why not subscribe and press the little bell icon? I'm sure everyone is asking you to press it, and so am I. Why? Well, because I deliver nightly spooks, and the best way to receive them is straight to your phone, and don't swipe it away. And also, if there's a story that you would like to share, you can email it to me or submit it to my Reddit. And thank you to everyone who entered the competition. I have been listening to everyone's selections. They are really good, and I will be emailing the shortlisted 3 very soon. Maybe I've already done it, depending on how efficient I am. I don't even know. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome. Thank you for listening to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.